Good day, good night. Welcome to Soccer Today. Somber Wednesday morning to talk about what happened last night, what happened in the World Cup qualifying, talk about the elimination of the United States from the World Cup. Busy show, amazing lineup, and we started off with Charles Boehm. Charles, how you doing this morning?
Good morning.
Charles.
I'm fine.
Charles, I guess the question to start the whole show is, and you had an article that came out late last night, or early this morning, I should say, on MLSsoccer.com, and sort of, you can summarize that. It sort of said, how? So we'll start it with the very basic question: how?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think listeners north of the border probably know how this works, right? Canada hasn't always reached the hex in the last few years, but it's much the same process. You don't generally die by one big result or one particular day. You die by multiple cuts. And in the U.S. case, this was sort of, in retrospect now at least, it was a long, slow walk into oblivion. This dates back to the really early in the cycle. The U.S. had to play a must-win game or two in the semifinal round. They lost at home to Guatemala 2.5 years ago now, I guess, or was that a year and a half ago? My piece, I dated it even further back, and we saw the signs of decay and stagnation in the Gold Cup 2 years ago in 2015, when the World Cup hangover lasted way longer than anybody thought it would or should. You throw in a coaching change in midstream, which was a panicky decision, but an understandable one. And then you had this margin for error that started out small with 2 losses to the 2 top teams in the Hex a year ago, and then it kept shrinking because of the national team's own mistakes and failings. The Hex format is fairly forgiving, and they managed to whittle away opportunity after opportunity to give themselves a little bit of breathing room.
This is the worst performance ever in the hexagonal, in the 5th round of qualification for the World Cup for the U.S. men's national team. 12 points, and their best effort, their worst effort before was 17 points. So 5 points below what usually at least they get in the last few years. It's not just one game, but last night, Charles, can you bring us through your living room how you saw those events unfold across the CONCACAF?
Yeah, it was really a perfect storm, at least from a U.S. point of view. And we do have to step back for a moment and give real credit and congratulations to Panama and Honduras. The formula that we've heard a million times, at least here in the U.S., is to go to the World Cup, you win at home, you draw on the road. The U.S. broke that rule repeatedly this cycle. They dropped 6 points at home. They dropped a lot of points on the road. But coming into this final match night, all they had to do was draw the worst team in the Hex. And there was a lot of talk before the U.S. Trinidad game about the playing surface, the flooding, the pitch, all those sorts of things. When it came down to it, that wasn't a factor. But you had my nerves began, I think, when I saw the starting lineup. Bruce Arena kept the exact same 11 and the exact same formation, a very attack-minded system with only one true defensive midfielder. The same squad that played 4 days ago in much different circumstances. So that contributed, I think, heavily to a lack of urgency, heavy legs on the Americans. Trinidad, scored early, which is really the recipe for an upset like the one they pulled off. And then, the 2-0 result, the 2-0 lead they had, really sort of got bums twitching, right? And American fans were following the results in Honduras and Panama, which at first were breaking the U.S. favor, right? You had Mexico and Costa Rica both had the leads in those games, and then through a variety of circumstances, the Honduras and Panama both came back at home. They fulfilled their end of the bargain. They won at home in really heroic circumstances, and what it came down to was very tight margins. And the grand irony is that it was MLS players scoring the winning goals in both cases. So really, as I said, a perfect storm that left the U.S. out of control of their own destiny, and powerless as things broke against them.
Yeah, I did enjoy the headline on MLSsoccer.com with it was MLS players past and present propel their teams to victory last night, which I thought was kind of funny, but nonetheless, Charles, I put
well, look, Duane. I mean, I think credit is due here. You know, there's a lot of we're going to have circular firing squads, and finger pointing, and rightly so here in the United States. But you know, MLS has created opportunities for CONCACAF players. They've taken them. They've improved themselves both individually and as a team. That should be welcomed by the United States as a country that has long complained about a lack of sufficient competition and not enough regional tests by the time we get to bigger events. So we got what we asked for. We got what we said we wanted. We've got better players and better teams in the region, and the United States simply didn't measure up on this occasion.
Well, let me continue with that discussion then. I mean, Panama and Costa Rica and Honduras are all utilizing MLS and taking advantage of that opportunity that's out there. But yet you see the U.S. stagnating, I guess, at sort of a best-case scenario, regressing in a worst-case scenario, even though MLS seems to be excelling at this point. Is there anything that the league isn't doing well for the American player then?
Well, here we get into some more complexity. The first thing that comes to mind for me is the whole approach of bringing Americans home. This is controversial, as you can imagine. There's a segment of the population here, soccer population, that thinks we need to get promising talents abroad as quickly as possible. It's not so simple as that. There's many different obstacles and challenges to getting blue chip talents into European or Latin American player development systems. But there's that school of thought, and then there's one that says, make MLS a league of choice for the best American and North American players. I think the true path, the best path, is probably somewhere in between. But the league has made it a conscious policy to try and bring the U.S. national team stars home. Perhaps that's worthy of some second guessing, again. But it's not necessarily the league's job. We can look back to the roots of MLS. It was founded in part to help the U.S. national team develop and improve. But that's no longer the raison d'etre of this league. The league has to act in its own interest and in the interest of its clubs and players and fans.
Charles, what to do now? I know it's easy to just do a clean slate, but what would you do right now, the morning after?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm not calling for this, but I would say that in a more advanced and intense soccer culture, leadership would not need a nudge to fall on their swords right now, and that some of the positions of power, where the work was simply not done, mission was not accomplished, there would be openings already, or at least within the next few hours. So I expect we've seen Bruce Arena coach his last national team game. I don't think Senor Galati, the president of U.S. Soccer, will choose this moment to bow out, but his re-election, which is scheduled, his next and final presidential election is in the winter. I think it just got a lot more complicated and a lot more difficult for him, although I still think he would win because of the power dynamics inside the federation. But I think there needs to be a wide-ranging and hard discussion at all levels, from the grassroots all the way to the very top, in a very public fashion, about what happened, what needs to change, seize this opportunity as a moment for real change. And that needs to happen, again, almost in the way of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's a real lack of transparency in the upper echelons of the game in this country. And I think that this is a great time to attack that head on, because everyone needs to be involved and needs to be outspoken and honest.
Charles, real quickly in our last minute here, you said that, and I think you're right on this, that we've seen Bruce Arena's last game in charge of the U.S. men's national team. I wonder whether we've seen the last game Bruce Arena's in charge of. Do you think that he comes back somewhere?
That's a great question, and I couldn't answer it for you now. It certainly seemed when he took this job that this was sort of the Italian job, like one more ride, one more mission for him, having accomplished so much in his career. I think it's going to sting, and I think back to the way Siggy Schmidt felt and the things he said after leaving Seattle in those circumstances that he did last year. I think it's hard for a competitor like that to go out with this being the final memory. But that's going to, I think, depend on his own sort of outlook and his energy levels and what he feels like doing at this point in his life. I certainly think there'll be opportunities for him to coach again at a high level in this country, but he may want and probably needs some time away from the game to collect himself.
Charles, thank you very much for your time today.
Of course, guys. Thanks for the postmortem.
And we're back on Soccer Today, our U.S. men's national team and what happened special. Joining us, the sole Canadian guest today, Rudi Schuller. Rudi, how you doing today?
I think I'm doing a lot better than the rest of your guests are.
That's a very, very fair and probably accurate point.
Rudi, I thought I wanted to have you on because there could be fallout to this on the Canadian side, and I thought that was an important discussion on a show like ours to have as well. So we'll just start right there. Obviously this is going to impact the United States a lot more than anywhere else, but because the Canadian system is so tied into the American system, is there a potential that that some of the the joy that we were seeing amongst certain Canadian people out there last night was misplaced, and that this is actually a bad news for the Canadian system as well?
I mean, it could be. I think it's too early to say, but you see on social media and in the articles and whatnot, there's just a ton of navel gazing going on, and that's going to be going on at the top as well. And at the top, of course, I mean MLS and the USSF, which are so intertwined with each other, and like you said, is intertwined with Canadian soccer at the top of the pyramid as well. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on MLS to change somehow, some way. I don't know what the changes are going to be, or if they're going to even be implemented. But I think there's going to be a lot of pressure for MLS to change. You're already starting to see it. You're starting to see the articles being written. You're starting to see the social media posts about it. And yeah, this is the stark reality of the U.S. having not having qualified since since 1986, when the last time they didn't care if they qualified or not. Now there's a lot of people and there's a lot of stakeholders involved, and a lot of those stakeholders are in MLS. So this could go one of two ways. I think they could go hyper domestic and try to really go on a domestic push, which could help Canada because they could include Canada in that, because we've seen that Canada's been included a little bit more over recent years, with some of the loosening up of the domestic rules in regard to Canadian players. Or you could see Canadian players being even more shut out. So I don't know. I can't predict. I don't know. But I think it's going to go one of those two ways.
It's kind of crazy to actually imagine that maybe, I blame Beckham. Since David Beckham came to the league 8 years ago, a little bit more than that, but it's been more than 2 cycles, right? And so we're actually seeing the effects now. The league's been open for more international players, more higher level international players, international signings, and you've seen the rise of other nations in CONCACAF. It's kind of interesting that maybe the DP rules and Beckham itself helped the rise of other countries in CONCACAF. But Rudi, let's just bring us to your last night. I've asked that question to Charles. It was kind of a crazy perfect storm. Everything that could go wrong went wrong. I was talking about it 0.001% yesterday, and it kind of all unfolded. A post, a save at the 87th minute. How did you experience that whole craziness?
It was nuts. I was actually watching the South American qualifiers first, and then I was kind of switching back and forth between that and the U.S. game. So just, I had a full night of just, as a neutral, it was crazy. I was feeling emotional for Lionel Messi, first of all, proving that he's the best player on the planet, and then the U.S. Having that heart-wrenching loss, and seeing once again Roman Torres kind of break the hearts of Michael Bradley and Josie Altidore for the second time in 9 months. Yeah, it was crazy. And of course, the first goal in that Panama game, I want to go back to that for a second. The first goal in that Panama game shouldn't have stood at all, which is, it's a talking point. Of course, that's not why the U.S. is ultimately out, but they can definitely point to that as a factor of the last day being what it was, because that shouldn't have been a goal, and Panama probably shouldn't have been in. But that's just the way it goes. They're all playing by the same rules, and the U.S. should have gone out and beaten Trinidad. It's just crazy. I was watching it, and having covered MLS for so long, and being kind of not in the bubble, but kind of like on the fringes of the bubble, being a Canadian, but working for an American company for so long, and working alongside a lot of Americans. I felt a lot of the same what they felt, even though I still see myself as a neutral, but I have a little bit more of a kind of interest in what the Americans do, just professionally and so on. So it was stunning to me because I didn't think, and the start of the night I was like, oh, they only need a tie, that's fine, and they could even lose, and like you've mentioned, it was such a slim margin for them being knocked out, and everything that had to come together did come together. So for me, it was just I was stunned, and I was actually working a shift, so it was kind of diverting me from my actual work. And I'm still kind of going back on it now. I'm still kind of stunned. They looked to be cruising a little bit. They were down 2-1, but they were carrying the play and things were going well. And all of a sudden you see on Twitter, oh, Panama scored. Oh, Honduras scored. Wait a minute. Oh my God, they're out right now if they don't do anything. And then Clint Dempsey hits the post, and it was crazy. I'm not nearly as emotionally invested as the rest of your panel will be, but I gotta say my heart was pounding basically the whole night.
No, Rudy, it was an incredible night all around. You mentioned the South American qualifiers. This is a night that Chile was eliminated, and we're not even talking about that Peru perhaps sets itself up to go to its first World Cup if it can get by New Zealand for the first time in 35 years. And we all both have a mutual friend there that I'm a little concerned he might end up in a ditch, but that's a different story for a different day.
2 mutual friends, actually, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, there you go. All right, so let's get back to the U.S. though. Is there something inherently wrong with the structure of Major League Soccer which is causing this problem? That's a debate that was flaring up on Twitter, and obviously it's coming from some of the more extreme ends last night. But is there something out there that we can point to?
Well, I mean, there has to be, right? I mean, it's not a talent issue because right now I put the U.S.'s talent pool at number 2, solidly number 2 in CONCACAF, with Mexico leading the way. And that hasn't changed. That hasn't changed just because they're out of the World Cup. So is it a selection issue? I think it was part of that too. I think Bruce Arena got it all wrong with his roster. But, he was brought in to be the safe choice because, Jurgen Klinsmann put them in a massive hole, and I think he had to go anyway. I think there was a selection issue. I think there was not enough players. I'm just reading something earlier. Not enough players in their prime in that roster. I think there were, if you accept that the prime years, quote unquote, are between 25 and 29, there were only 4 players on that roster last night that fit that bill. The rest were either over 30 or under 24, or 24 and under, and not ready for prime time yet. So, other than Pulisic, of course, who I think it's just terrible that he's not playing in the World Cup. But that's neither here nor there. But yeah, I do think that all the aspects of the U.S. soccer pyramid are going to be looked at, and there are flaws. Of course, there are. There were flaws even if they qualified and they topped the hex. It's just the way it is. You can't have a perfect system. I don't think Germany thinks they have a perfect system, even though they're the most dominant team on the planet right now. There are flaws to be made. It's too expensive to get into soccer in the U.S. and in Canada, by the way. Academies are mostly pay to play, other than maybe obviously the MLS academies if you can get there, but you have to show yourself off first at a pay to play academy before that happens, and a handful of others that are free for some of the best players. So there's a lot of roadblocks set up for the young player, the kids growing up and the players trying to make an impression, and we see a lot of it up here too. So a lot of those roadblocks now have to be looked at, and I think there's going to be a lot of talk about trying to remove those because if they stay up, then we're going to see a lot of the similar problems come up in 4 years' time, even though I think the U.S. will be fine in the long run because we're still in CONCACAF and they're still number 2 in talent.
In the last minute that we have, Rudi, I'm wondering what advice you have for our listeners down south. We have been there before, quite often actually missing the World Cup. What advice do you have to American soccer fans?
Well, it's tough. It's tough to relate because they're used to making the World Cup, whereas we're not. We're used to never making the World Cup. So it's kind of tough because I think we become numb to it and we expect not to really make it that far, whereas they expect to dominate and actually generally have a good run at the World Cups. So I can just say that, you know what, despite all of it, the game is growing. It's obviously growing in the U.S. and it's obviously growing in Canada. You know, we're seeing what Atlanta United's doing. We're seeing what other cities are doing in MLS, and we're seeing, you know, a superstar on the world stage who's an American, who's unfortunately not going to be at the World Cup next year, but he's a superstar in his own right. And you know, in another 4 years, he could be one of the top 5 players on earth. We don't know. He might not be, but he has the potential to be. So I think there's a lot to hang their hat on if you're an American fan. That, you know, things will be okay. Like I just mentioned, you know, at worst, the U.S. is number 2 in the talent pool of CONCACAF. So that's not going to change, I don't think, ever, just because of all the factors that involved. And they've got their own budding superstar, and MLS is still growing. So there's all these things, I think, that point to brighter days in the future, but there's a lot of work to be done. And if you can help out, then do that, because there's nothing else to do now. There's no point being, you know, get your morning out and then kind of get to work, because there's brighter days ahead.
Rudi, thank you for your time today.
No problem, guys. I'll talk to you next time.
And we're back on Soccer Today. Joining us once again today, Jonathan Tannenwald. Jonathan, last night...
You ready?
Yeah, last night. We were talking about actually yesterday, like a 0.001%, and it happened. How you doing?
I'm pleased, having been listening to the show already this morning, your previous guests. I am pleased to hear that they have called in from fortifications stronger than glass houses.
Okay.
Because boy, oh boy, as we know, I was a city planning student back in the day. I've seen the number of glass houses that have gotten built in Canada's major cities in recent years, and they got windows that are great places to throw stones from. Especially when your national pastime is hating America.
Okay, well, fair enough. There certainly were some Canadians on Twitter last night that were enjoying it a great deal. I mean, I was astounded by it, is where I come down on this one. But Jonathan, look, I asked Charles off the top how, so I'm going to ask you the same question. It's a very simple question, but how did this happen?
I got a simple answer. They ain't good enough.
That is a simple answer. How are they not good enough, though? So give me some more specifics on where exactly they need to improve.
This group of players, this group of coaches, this group of administrators are not good enough. And, you know, I've seen the number one reaction on social media has been, I'm better than this. And yes, that's I'm better than this, not we're better than this. It's I'm better than this. No. No. If you lose as many games in World Cup qualifying as you do, as the U.S. has, you don't deserve to go. And ultimately it means that your players are not good enough on the international level, and that you have to go call in different players. They were given a chance to prove that they were good enough, and they failed. And that includes Bruce Arena. It is not contradictory to say that Bruce Arena is the greatest coach that America has produced, and Bruce Arena failed, because both of those things are true. It indicts the quality of coaching in this country. It indicts the players. It very much indicts Sunil Gulati, as I and many other people have said. And you know, there are ways in which it indicts Major League Soccer. Yes, there is going to be the push for promotion and relegation in MLS has got now the biggest shot in the arm that it has needed, including from a lot of people who might others said it wasn't time yet. Well, now it is. Now it may well be time. because now you do have to make some pretty big changes to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And you cannot just be complacent and assume that it was a fluke, because it wasn't a fluke. So, you know, yes, Michael Bradley and Clint Howard and Tim Howard and Clint Dempsey and a lot of other guys should be done. And there are players who should have been there last night that were not, whether Sacha Kljestan or Weston McKennie or any number of other guys who would have, at the very least, allowed Bruce Arena to not play the exact same lineup for the second game in a row and run those guys into the ground and have some fresh legs and a little more energy out there on the field. But this has been coming. And it's been coming for a while. And, you know, what I said, what a number of people said when Jurgen Klinsmann was fired and Bruce Arena was hired was, we need to deal with the present and see if we can just get to Russia. Well, they failed at that. So now you can get to doing all the other things and making what should be some pretty big reforms. And as I said last night during the game, that starts with Sunil Gulati's tenure as U.S. Soccer president, probably ending. Whether it's going to end tomorrow or the day after or when the election comes, I don't know. But the other thing that I think has to change is the mentality of a lot of these U.S. fans who go around, you know, puffing their chests out and saying, I am better than this. No, you aren't. One of the biggest failures, Duane, this happens all over the continent, you know. One of the biggest failures among the soccer fan base in the United States and Canada is a refusal to deal with things as they actually are instead of how anybody wants them to be. It sure would help a lot if that would change.
What do we do the morning after, Jonathan?
We go on Twitter and yell.
All right.
And YouTube and yell and you know, all these other things. And all the rest of us sit here, you know? I'm lucky. I have access. I can ask questions and try to get some answers. A little hard for me when I'm not in Trinidad to ask the players and the coaches who were down there. They ain't going to be, you know, Alejandro Bedoya is not going to be back in Philadelphia until Thursday. Well, okay, I can't, what am I supposed to do? Go hijack the plane and ask him now? No.
All right, Jonathan. You mentioned some players there, and we've got 2 minutes left here. Mentioned some players. You said, do you think Bradley will be done? You mentioned a couple others. How much of a turnover of the roster do you think we'll see in the next few months?
I hope a lot. I can't tell you absolutely what is going to happen because one of the fascinating questions right now is, you know, who should the next U.S. national team senior level coach be? I don't know. For a while, I thought I knew, and now I don't. You know, maybe they really do need somebody. They need somebody from outside who can shake up the system. But if you do that, and that coach can't work with the American player and work with the American system and goes around like a bull in a china shop, it's one thing to affect reform. It's another to go around like a bull in a china shop. So who's that foreign coach? I don't know. A lot of people want David Wagner from Huddersfield Town. Well, what if they get their doors blown off in the Premier League? Maybe he doesn't look so great anymore. Is it Oscar Parejo? Well, look at where FC Dallas is right now. Not so great. Is it Peter Vermes? Well, he's going to be sort of the establishment candidate. And a lot of people want to go outside the establishment. So, then what?
Then what is the question of the day, Jonathan? We are tight for you today, and I'm sure we'll have you on again soon enough. But thanks for your time, and we look forward to you getting asked those questions. Don't hijack the plane, though, okay?
We'll see you in the Nations League, gentlemen.
There you go. Yes, we do have that to look forward to, whatever that may be.
And we're back on Soccer Today. Joining us to talk about U.S. men's national team again in our What Happened special. Paul Tenorio. Paul, how you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Always a pleasure.
Paul, look, you're now our fourth guest here. I've asked the same question to three of them, so I'll just start the same way with you. And the question is simple. It's how. How did this happen?
Well, there's not a simple answer to that, right? I mean, there's so many different layers and levels to this, but I think this is something that happened over the course of many, many months. It happened with it began, even at the beginning of qualification, this team did not look very good before we even got to the Hex. And then when you start at the Hex with two losses in a row, a loss at home to Mexico, and then a terrible, terrible loss on the road in Costa Rica, where as bad as the U.S. looked in Trinidad, it was just as bad in Costa Rica. And then you lose at home to Costa Rica. I mean, the games continued to play out the same way. I don't think there was enough change within this team. I don't think that there has been enough of a vision for what's ailing this team and trying to fix it. I was extremely disappointed to hear Bruce Arena say last night that this team was going to need major change ahead of the World Cup next summer. If that's the case, he should have had the gumption to make those changes now. But I think at the grand level, this is an indictment of both the small picture of one team not being good enough and the big picture of a federation that needs to really start to look at how it's developing players in the long term.
Paul, where this non-qualification actually happened, was it earlier in the Hex tournament? Was it somewhere in the roster selection? Was it with the coach's decision, whichever, Jurgen or Bruce? Where was this World Cup qualifying actually failed? Where did it happen?
I mean, all of this, there's no one person to point at. You can't point at Bruce Arena and say it's just his fault and Jurgen would have gotten us there. There's no way to prove that. And the only evidence of Jurgen Klinsmann's qualification in this Hex was 2 losses. So yes, responsibility falls on Jurgen Klinsmann too. He also had the team for 5 years. So the development and growth of that group of players going into this cycle falls on Jurgen Klinsmann as much as anyone else. Does responsibility fall on Bruce Arena? Absolutely. They played terribly at home against Costa Rica and lost. They went on the road multiple times and only picked up draws. And then they lost on the road against last place Trinidad with the World Cup on the line. There were lineup choices that were the wrong ones, but more importantly, the players did not play as though the World Cup was on the line. I think there was an overconfidence in this group, and I think Bruce Arena actually leads that attitude. I really do. I believe that he had a snarkiness about him after the game on Friday in the press conference after beating Panama 4-0, as though any journalists that had been questioning this path to the World Cup didn't know what they were talking about. That's the vibe he gave off, at least to me, and yet they didn't qualify. So at the end of the day, there's responsibility for everyone. And by the way, the players, it wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough from Josie Altidore, Bobby Wood, both of whom I thought were invisible last night. It wasn't good enough from Tim Howard. I thought that was a savable own goal. And really, if you go back and watch, I don't know how soon he jumped, but far before the ball was even close to him. It wasn't good enough from Omar Gonzalez in the back line, just as it hasn't been all qualification round. So the blame is on everyone here.
Paul, yeah, let's continue with the player vein there. This was a team that is somewhat veteran. There are a lot of guys that are just automatic. Put them in the roster, put them on the field. It doesn't matter what the circumstances. They're just slotted in there almost automatically. How many of those guys have maybe seen, considering we're 600 days or so away from the next competitive game the U.S. is going to play in the Gold Cup, how many have probably seen their last important U.S. action? How much turnover do you think this roster will have?
Yeah, I think a lot of them have, right? I mean, what does this mean for Tim Howard? He's done, right? He's done. He'll get a farewell match somewhere down the road, but he won't play another competitive match for the U.S. Sadly, Clint Dempsey missed out on a huge opportunity to score at a 4th World Cup. DeMarcus Beasley is finished. I think Omar Gonzalez has seen his last competitive game for the U.S. national team. Matt Beasler, Graham Zusi, perhaps even Michael Bradley, depending on what happens in the next couple of years. there is a large core of this group that will not be around when the U.S. has a chance at 2022. That's a good thing, by the way. They shouldn't be looking to those guys to get them there. And for some of them who won't be aged out but will be replaced anyways, it's a good sign for U.S. soccer. The focus now has to be on developing and growing these players that we're seeing at the U17 World Cup right now, the players that we saw last summer at the U20 World Cup. The kids that are 14, 15, 16 years old that are on youth fields right now are going to be the ones that are playing in the World Cup in 2026. That's where the focus has to be going forward. But absolutely, there's going to be massive change in this senior national team moving forward.
If we're looking at the pyramid and the manager, head coach, there will probably be a new one. Bruce Arena has probably coached his last match with the U.S. men's national team. What direction would you go, Paul? Would you go with a foreign experienced coach to rebuild that pyramid the way he have done it somewhere else? I don't know, Del Bosque with Spain, maybe he's a little bit too old, but is something similar? Or would you trust someone that has been raised in this pyramid? What would you do going forward?
I could care less what it says on their birth certificate about where they were born. This coach has to, whoever comes in has to have the right ideas of how to move this team forward. And a big part of that, whether people like it or not, a big part of that is Major League Soccer. Okay, if you think bringing a coach in who's going to say Major League Soccer is not a part of the U.S. national team and that every player in U.S. needs to go to Europe, then it's going to be a failure. And that's a fact. That's not an interpretation or an opinion. The domestic league of any club, of any country, is crucial to the U.S. national team, to the national team's success. Whether we're talking about France, England, Costa Rica, the U.S., whatever country you want to point to, they go hand in hand. You cannot fill out an entire roster of players playing elsewhere. And if you did, it would be with such a poor short-term vision that team and that country would not develop into anything over the years, okay? So it doesn't matter to me whether this coach is coming from Spain or France or England or Brazil or Argentina or the U.S., as long as there's an understanding of how to move forward, not just with MLS. Certainly you're going to be pulling players in that are playing in Germany and elsewhere, but that there has to be an understanding of how this system works in the U.S. And there also has to be an impetus to push for change. I think the most important thing that has to happen in leadership in this country is we need new voices at the top. New voices at the top of U.S. soccer, new voices at the top of Major League Soccer, and new voices at the top of the U.S. national team.
In 5 years' time, Paul, if we're having this conversation, will we look back on this day for American soccer and look at it as a blessing in disguise, or is this something that's going to maybe take the game back for a couple of years?
I just don't buy the idea that something this bad is a good thing for U.S. soccer. Change is going to come. Change should come, and it would have come eventually, right? It's not as though if the U.S. had qualified for the World Cup, they would have stopped trying to make things better in development. That being said, sometimes when you go through a massive failure, as big as this is, as massive an embarrassment as this is, it forces you to look deeper than you would have. And that has to be the hope. You have to hope, if you're a fan of U.S. soccer, that this leads things in the right direction. And it's not a good thing, but you hope that it creates the change that's needed.
To finish, Paul, when you look, example, at Germany in the early 2000s, they went through a very terrible time. And at a great meeting with everyone involved, from Bundesliga 1 to the Association of Football in Germany, and they created a 10-year plan. What would you do in a way? Do you need to unite, in a way, American soccer to push it forward?
Yeah, I think there absolutely needs to be some level of bringing together a country right now that, just like in the country itself, but the country soccer has been split, and you know, there's all the pro-rel stuff, there's everything else, and really it's all about trying to move soccer in this country forward in the best way possible. And you know, there's a lot that needs to be done, and you know, I just think the vision has to be one. It has to be one vision about how they're going to approach coaching education, how they're going to approach the budget going forward, how they're going to improve the development academy, how they're going to improve youth soccer, how they're going to find more coaches that can afford to go through coaching license programs. There are so many areas that there needs to be that need to be changed in the coming days.
Paul, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks so much, guys.
And we're back on Soccer Today with Jeff Rueter. Jeff, how do we feel the morning after? Jeff.
You there?
All right, Duane.
Forwarded to an automatic voice message system.
All
3,
right.
2.
We'll get Jeff on the line in a second, but it's very interesting, Duane, how the conversation quickly turns to development. The last 9 years of U.S. men's national team development at a high level, different level of the pyramid. And one thing Taylor Twellman mentioned yesterday at the end of the broadcast, he mentioned the Olympics. The last 2 Olympic cycles, there was no U.S. men's national team. There was no USA. There was no presence. And you kind of see the result of that.
The Olympic team situation, yeah, the U.S. has missed out on that several cycles now. So, and as you say, that was something they took great pride in with the long run they went. That was a ways back now. That was when Landon was in that team. So you've got to go a long ways back for that run. But to miss out on the youth levels, and they've had a few failings on the youth sides, on the U20s as well. You can look at that as a red flag. Now, what I'd say about that, Kevin, is that it's a tough slog to it's not necessarily a direct line between youth failure and world and senior failure when you look at clubs or teams around the world, because sometimes there's other factors going there. But when in North America, it might be a little more of a direct connection, because the same situation that you see in, especially with the European teams, where they don't necessarily have their best players on a U20 team, say, or an Olympic team, where it's not prioritized. It doesn't exist here. They do take it fully seriously. Look, there's a lot to unpack here, and obviously the nature of this show being less than, I guess a little more than 12 hours after this all played out is going to be, if not hot takes, then at least lukewarm takes, right? So we do have to be somewhat careful about that, and there does need to be some calm, sober reflection in the next few days for American soccer fans out there. But I think, as Paul said there, and what other guests have said as well, this isn't happening overnight, and there's not necessarily an instant of an instant moment where, oh my God, this is a failure. Now we know that something's wrong. There has been a lot of rumblings about there being problems within the American system, within the North American system, and many of the problems they have are the same that we've had up here for years, that we've talked to death. They're just, the scale is different because they have so much more resources that just size wise, that they can sort of overcome them a little bit more. But that's sort of where we're coming here. Why don't we, Kevin, try him one more quick time, and then if we don't get him, we'll just continue our discussion right now.
All right, let's call Jeff live radio. It's always fun, and so as we try to get Jeff on the line, it was quite a fascinating adventure, though. Like going through last night, it was interesting to me to see it all unfold. I don't know about you, Duane, but I was watching it on BN Sport, and the way the broadcast was made, it was fascinating how it happened. And I have to say, it was like what 0.1% we were saying yesterday, and never in my entire life I was freaking out by myself, like watching it, and I was yelling and screaming on my phone. And what are the chances? And I can relate to the feeling, and I'm wondering, like, what are all the things that went wrong? Is it possible? Yes, it's that. Do we need to have like a harsh reaction? Do we need to fire everyone, to start anew, to try to maybe have a different pyramid philosophy. What is there to do?
Well, yeah, it does beg the question, Kevin. I mean, look, I think that the idea that Major League Soccer onto itself and the structure, particularly the structure of Major League Soccer, which is the default of a lot of people, we got to go pro-rel, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, is a little silly, especially when you look at the fact that the teams that are qualifying, the teams that qualified ahead of the U.S., had a majority of their players coming through Major League Soccer. So it's not Major League Soccer on its own. That's not operating in isolation. And, if you flipped a switch and had Pro-Rel starting tomorrow, it's not going to change what happened. It's not going to change anything. It's not going to make them more driven. I find that argument silly that, they operate without pressure. That's a load of crap. There's pressure in Major League Soccer. It's just not in a relegation battle. It's to make the playoffs or to win championships. And if you don't think there's pressure there, I don't think you understand sport. It's not just pressure to, battle whether you're going to finish 17th or 16th, for God's sakes, people. I mean, that's a little silly. There's pressure at every level of a pyramid at every particular point in a system. So flipping a switch and going pro-rel is not going to solve the problems that happen here. I think, and Charles, I encourage you to read Charles's article on MLSsoccer.com, which came out around 1 a.m. last night. It breaks down the 5 moments that you could see this coming, and it all starts back with the game against Guatemala back in the semifinal round. And I remember watching that when the U.S. had their ass handed to them 3-0, and this is like, well, that's interesting. And then obviously you saw them lose to Costa Rica and at Red Bull Arena. That was a difficult one. I think that was ultimately the day that they truly lost this, because you have to take care of your home points, as we well know. But it was such a maddeningly, if you're a U.S. fan, a maddeningly inconsistent performance throughout the X, where they would, go beat Panama 4-0, and then the next day, lose 2-1 to Trinidad. But, it happened. And what I would say to the fact that it doesn't look like Jeff's going to get on the line here, that's unfortunate, but we'll move on, and we'll move to Dave Clark next in about 4 minutes. But, the idea, if I can go one more second, if I can give a pep talk to our American friends out there, Kevin, and I'll let you jump in after that. This isn't going to kill the game down there. That's patently absurd. The game is going to continue to grow. The World Cup's going to happen next year in 2018. And you know what? A lot of Americans that have become soccer fans are going to find a new way to enjoy it. They're not going to have massively full city squares like we saw in 2014. And that's unfortunate. And that is going to mean that there are probably going to be less new fans coming in. But the fans that are there already, with very few exceptions, are going to go to pubs and bars and cafes and their living room, and they're going to watch a World Cup, and they're going to enjoy that World Cup, and they're going to experience it in the way that we're damn well used to, where you're going to adopt a team that maybe has heritage connection to you. You're going to maybe adopt a team like Iceland that you just kind of like as their story, and you're going to enjoy that World Cup, and it's still going to be a great experience for everyone. And it's not ultimately going to, I think, have any long-term effect on the growth of popularity of the game in the United States. It's just going to continue to grow. The Premier League is going to continue to attract new fans. Major League Soccer is going to continue to attract more fans. And this failing, it's going to be forgotten in about 2 years when the U.S. women are playing in the Women's World Cup in France, because in the United States, like here in Canada, the Women's World Cup is, close to par, if not at par, with the Men's World Cup in terms of its popularity. So it's not that long to wait, really. And maybe it's my Canadian perspective, Kevin, when I say, suck it up, make changes that you need to, be angry, of course. We're still angry about 8-1 up here, and that's happened 5 years ago now.
It's USA's 8-1. Last night was USA's 8-1. But I think it's the shock that was needed. I think it's the end of the complacency era. I think it's a good way to put the last 4 years and a half. I mean, more than that. Since more in Brazil, since the last qualification, I think the last two, I think the way the pyramid is built, the way players are funneled through, the way players, like you mentioned earlier, talking about getting a spot and just getting penciled in and just penned in all the time, not necessarily due to performance or to form. And I think it's the end of that complacency era. And now they needed a shock to make sure that now, all right, let's focus on what we're doing. Let's pay attention. And I think that's what's going to be the result of last night. They will pay attention.
Yeah. And there's already some tweets coming out from a U.S. Soccer Board of Directors people. There's one that just went out a few minutes ago talking about that this was unacceptable and it's time for revolution. That was pretty much the wording that they used in that tweet. I'm again a member of the U.S. Soccer Board of Directors. All right, Kevin, let's try and get Dave on the line now.
Joining us now on Soccer Today, Dave Clark. Dave, how you doing today?
It is a great day, maybe. Not in soccer.
It's a sounder that killed the dreams too. How's that going to play?
Hello?
Yep, we're here, Dave.
Okay.
Did we lose him?
Nope.
Live radio again.
We're all here. So, how does it feel, Dave, to have a sounder killing the hopes of the United States for 2018?
Yeah, that's an interesting dichotomy because you're getting into the club versus country.
All right.
thing.
Well, obviously
so
there's a connection
moment,
issue with
I'm
Dave,
thrilled for
Kevin. So shall we
like
give it a quick try again?
And Jovan Jones and all these national team players representing their countries. And several of them going. Nikos Ladero's going to the World Cup. Torres is going to the World Cup, and yet I'm living with the knowledge that it's quite likely that Clint Dempsey played his last competitive match. I can't envision a way that he's in the Gold Cup in 2019. That an era of U.S. soccer is going to end. That one of their greatest players who plays for both the club I support and the nation I support is done, and in such a shameful kind of way. Just there's no glorious end. There's no one last time wearing the armband. There's no. He's merely tied with Landon Donovan rather than breaking the record. That's not the way you expected Clint Dempsey to go out. You expected Clint Dempsey to go out leading some kind of charge in a tournament where the U.S. was the plucky underdog that outperformed one of the greats and then gets crushed in the next round. But you didn't expect it to be outperformed by CONCACAF.
What to do the morning after, Dave? That's what I'm wondering, and I've been asking all the guests today. Is what is there to do today?
I would actually say slow down on the hot take machine. A lot of the people out there with these supposedly brilliant ideas are just using the loss to reinforce what they supposedly already knew. Many of the suggestions on how to fix U.S. soccer are the exact same that you read 6 months ago or a year ago or 3 years ago. And while several of them haven't been implemented yet, there's a big reason why. It's a lot harder to make those kinds of changes. Like ending pay to play is one of the common things. And ending pay to play is not why Trinidad beat the United States. Clint Dempsey and those players didn't underperform because they paid for soccer 10 and 15 years ago. They were the more talented team. They were outperformed on the night. So, ending pay to play doesn't fix the short-term issues. The short-term issues had to do with coaching, lack of player motivation, which oftentimes comes down to coaching as well. The short-term issues had to do with Jurgen and Bruce and Sunil and those kind of dynamics at the upper level where they've ignored some of what makes the game fun and interesting for too long, taking an overly pragmatic look. I'd slow down on and do the research. A lot of people with large platforms are suggesting spend that $100 million on X. They see it as a way to, spend the $100 million surplus to end pay to play. Well, you got $25 per youth soccer player. That doesn't end pay to play. Solidarity and training payments, that doesn't end pay-to-play either, because there's even less than $100 million there for the 4 million youth soccer players in the United States. Get more coaches, which is great, but if being a professional coach requires that individual to make a non-living wage, it's not just a problem about the lack of coaches. How many people want to go into coaching when 98% of coaches, soccer coaches in America, aren't getting paid a living wage to do it? And professionalizing those ranks is important. I would say, you know, part of what I want to do is slow down and look in depth and understand that it is a massive problem for a sport with an enormous budget, yet somehow doesn't have enough money to make the changes necessary.
Is it the time for a revolution? We have to unite some executive on social media of the United States Soccer Federation saying it's unacceptable and it's time for a revolution. Is it time? Is it the right mindset to actually have now?
Well, yeah, I don't even know if it'll create a revolution, but they definitely need to fire leadership. They've been in place for years. They've had grand plans. I remember when Project 2010 was supposed to make the U.S. One of the 10 greatest nations of the world. And we're almost 10 years past that. And while it produced some players and it led to Bradenton being successful at producing talent, it's clearly an outdated model. And the new model doesn't seem to support what they want. So I would say, I mean, there's no way that you can look at Sunil Gulati right now and say, yeah, you did a great job. Between the stagnation at the women's national team, the youth national team levels, which failed for so many years, whether at the U17, U20, and Olympic levels, and now the senior national team for the men. It's a series of failures under Sunil Gulati over the last 5-6 years. So what is he doing? What is he doing? And I know it's not a paid position, but what's he doing to earn that place of respect and honor and authority if it's not producing a U.S. team capable of qualifying as one of the 3.5 best teams from a region that really should only have 2 good teams?
Now, what I'm actually wondering as well is we talked about Bruce Arena before on this show today. What direction would you go in, Dave? What kind of manager in the future? Because we're always talking about, the next future, or is it a transitional coach, or we're getting the coach that's going to stay there for 4 to 8 years. What should we do? Is now the time to think in the future and make the future the present?
Yeah, the coaching situation is difficult. For me, I think that hiring Bruce Arena to replace Jurgen Klinsmann was the right idea. And but at the same point, his failures indicate that even though it was probably the most logical and easiest decision, that he doesn't need to stick around. And when I look at great MLS coaches right now, I don't really think any of them are ready for that. I mean, there used to be a thing where people suggested Jason Christ be the national team coach, and now you look at him 2.5 years, 3 years removed from his success at Real Salt Lake, and you're like, well, he's not it. Caleb Porter is one of the guys that failed at the Olympic level, and while he has managed to do pretty decent things with Portland, he's really only had 2 great years of his 4 there. You look at Oscar Pereira, who obviously has a talent for scouting and for development, and might be great in a technical director or youth national team role. I don't see any indication that he's right for a senior national team. And so then you have to cast the net far and wide, and you have to find someone that's willing to both work within U.S. Soccer's Byzantine system and bring in new ideas and figure out how to break down those walls. And that's what they tried to do with Jurgen, and it failed because he was a bad coach. Whether or not his ideas for massive restructuring of MLS and U.S. Soccer were ever going to work out, his first role and his most important role was as a coach of the senior national team, and that's where he wasted his opportunity to make massive change within the United States.
Dave, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
And we're back on Soccer Today with Duane Rollins, and joining us as well from 55-1, Wes Burdine. Wes, how you doing the morning after?
I've had better years in my life, but yeah, I'm at least awake and still living.
Wes, when I booked you last night, you promised me this would be NSFW. Are we still gonna have to put the explicit warning on our iTunes account?
I mean, at this point, I've moved from anger into. This morning, I woke up, took a shower, and put on some sackcloth and ashes on my head. So, I'm just in the deep state of depression.
All right, we're going through the stages. All right, look, let's start with this, Wes. As someone who's a passionate fan of the program, what will it mean next summer to not have a home team in the World Cup for you personally, and expand on that, and what do you think it'll mean for the general fan in general?
I mean, for me personally, it's just a disaster that we'll keep on feeling the effects of for a long time. I mean, the greatest soccer moments I can remember are the moments that we've been able to have in those big tournaments, and not being able to create those memories for myself, for young people, for anyone who's going to get into soccer. The opportunities that are going to be missed are just innumerable. Really, and not to speak crassly about commercial opportunities, but if you look at how the waves of soccer fandom happen, it is every 4 years you're able to capture the imagination of some of these new fans who get caught up in World Cup, and not being able to do that and direct them toward U.S. teams is really, it's kind of crappy, right? I mean, all these people who will watch the World Cup, they'll just assume, and rightly or wrongly, that, oh, well, I'm just going to get into watching the Bundesliga or something else rather than MLS or USL or NESL or whatever, because obviously if the US isn't here, American soccer sucks, right? And so all these things, the knock-on effects are just, it is a colossal disaster.
Now, one question we've been asking all the guests today, Wes, is how. What I'm actually wondering is when. When did this go wrong?
Well, the best article written in the last few months about U.S. soccer was Brian Soretta's article on American Soccer Now that came out last week, and that was pointing really at this problem that we have no 22 to 28-year-olds in our team, or 24, I think is the age. I mean, we've got maybe one or two, and that there's this lost generation of where you only have basically DeAndre Yedlin in this age group. And so how and when it started in the 90s, where we weren't picking up on these players and finding enough players and bringing them through. I think that that is a legitimate problem, where we can talk about, getting ready for the 2022 World Cup, and, oh, well, these guys have to retire and Michael Bradley needs to go and all that. But like, okay, well, are you just going to replace them all with 21-year-olds? I mean, we just don't have the players who should be in their prime. And that's a problem that we can't just fix overnight.
Wes, yeah, look, not to draw it into to us up here because obviously our problems are a little different in the sense that the scale's different and our, we've never had the same success that the US has had. But I've often looked at sort of the development of the academies and when they started and what that means for Canadian soccer. And I think you can extrapolate that into the American sense too, is that the MLS academies really didn't get going until 2010 or so. They started a little before that, but in terms of actually producing players on any level at all, it wasn't until the early part of this decade and probably even a little bit further into it. So with that said, do you think that there is hope that's down at that level? And if so, is there something that MLS and other levels of the game can do to try and integrate those young academy prospects into the first teams a little bit better than they are currently?
Well, I think that I think the problem, and I think you should worry about this, particularly in Canada, because you only have 3 MLS teams. The problem is we need to stop thinking about it from that MLS is the main focal point of U.S. soccer. That is a huge problem, and I think one of the problems that got us here, right? U.S. soccer serves the needs of MLS rather than MLS being one of the ways that soccer in America serves U.S. soccer. The U.S. men's national team should be at the top of men's soccer. And instead, I think MLS is. And so MLS's academy initiatives are in some places great, right? We all want to talk about how good Dallas is. But for the most part, it's not particularly good, right? I mean, there's, other people who are smarter than me and know more about academies. We'll talk about all the pay-to-play stuff. But we have to just do a better job of having more soccer that comes out on in spaces and developing outside of MLS. And FC Edmonton up in Canada is a really good example, right? The Fats have created an academy system that actually does produce pretty good talent, especially for being up in Edmonton. And FC Edmonton has never been a particularly great senior side, but its academy is pretty good. And we don't have that many teams doing something similar in the U.S. So there needs to be more, more actual grassroots development of soccer outside of MLS, outside of NASL and USL. There needs to just be, we need to be focusing down on the bottom first and building the pyramid that way.
When we're looking at the roster selection and other aspect of the U.S. men's national team over the last 3 years, there seems to be one word that describes a lot for me. And I know it's easy to say from an outside perspective, and it's easy to say the morning after, but complacency has been a factor. The roster selection, the players already penned in before the beginning of the training camp, and not necessarily having opportunity for players to rise up and actually get a sniff. If we're going back a few years ago, and you'll remember this, Wes, Miguel Ibarra had to basically play out of his mind to even get a sniff just because he wasn't part of the MLS family, just because he was in the NASL with Minnesota United at that point. And what does it say now? Is it the end of the complacency era?
No, I mean, no. We it should be. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, Klinsmann had his problems, but among the things that he genuinely wanted to do was point out the ways in which there's just an arrogance that from MLS and from parts of American soccer and from people like Bruce Arena, where that because players were not succeeding in a particular system or whatever, that was their fault. And you can get it like something like Christian Ramirez, right? That the guy has scored so many goals in NASL, and well, he hasn't done it on a higher level. Well, that's not really his fault. That's the problem of the weird financial structures of MLS and U.S. soccer. Right? And not even bringing him into the Gold Cup it is, I think, a problem, right? You have to have scored, be the Golden Boot winner in MLS like 3 years in a row in order to get looked at. I do think that there is just a kind of complacency and arrogance that from MLS that Bruce is kind of the perfect example of. And I'm a big MLS fan. I think that, I'm not saying that we shouldn't value the talent in MLS, players like Chris Wondolowski. But I think that there is just this smugness that comes from parts of MLS soccer that assumes its greatness.
Wes, good luck. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks.
And we're back on Soccer Today. Joining us to talk about last night and the ramification of last night in the different spectrum of soccer, Bo Dora. Bo, how are you?
I'm okay. It's funny. 24 hours ago, the prospect of the U.S. missing the World Cup seemed almost just kind of amusing. I thought there was sort of that would wake some people up and so forth. I think the reality setting in is a little grimmer. I think when you start looking at people who aren't going to have a chance to get back to the World Cup, or the fact that Christian Pulisic isn't going to get there until he's 24, and having seen a lot of my kids' soccer games, I have this sort of pessimistic view now where I start thinking, oh my goodness, suppose Pulisic turns into, a George Weah type who never gets to play in the World Cup, So yeah, reality's kind of grim, but I don't know. We'll have to see what we do next.
We can talk about it if you have Duane Rosario, Atiba Hutchison, a few Canadian players that never got that chance over the years, so we're well used to it, Bo. But we wanted to bring Bo on to have a little slightly different. We're going to get Bo's take on the men's side too, obviously, after we give him the chance to talk about his wheelhouse here, and that's the women's side of the game. What does this mean, if anything, to the U.S. women's program, the fact that the U.S. men have failed to qualify for this World Cup?
Well, the biggest mistake U.S. soccer could make, and the biggest mistake those of us who talk about U.S. soccer could make, would be to say, oh, well, these problems exist only on the men's side. No, they don't. The same problems are in effect on the women's side. Now, granted, it's a different sport. It's a different it's a different qualifying gauntlet. I mean, the U.S. women's team has never had to play a game like the one the U.S. men played last night. So, let's make that absolutely clear. They've never had to go play on, a bumpy grass, waterlogged field with that much at stake. It's simply never happened. They've had to play on bad artificial turf for friendlies, but that's another issue. But the problems stem from the youth system, where we talk about pay to play, but then it's difficult to end that. What we really need to do is mitigate that. And part of the problem there is that while academies are trying to go free, at least the ones that are affiliated with professional clubs, the cost of everything else is rising. And a big part of that is because we have these turf wars where everyone's trying to be the elite league, and they're trying, they have to have an arms race essentially. We're gonna travel to Disney and to Texas and to there and there and there, and that's going to get your kid seen by scouts, and that's going to get your kid either a chance to play in the pros or play in college. And a wake-up call for me a few years ago was seeing that there were people who knew they were spending more on their kids' soccer than they could possibly get back in a college scholarship. They were doing it to get their kids into a better college. That was astounding to me. That just, if you want to hear messed up American priorities in a nutshell, that's it. Sort of like, oh, well, my kid wants to get into Virginia or Duke or Stanford. I'd better spend more on his or her soccer than I'm going to get back in a scholarship, if there is one, which there usually isn't.
What is there to do, Bo, today when we're looking at the possible ramification of this? Maybe more investment, but the amount of money, and it just goes back maybe to a bit of the rant of Taylor Twellman yesterday, and everybody's heard it by now, that 2.5-minute rant. That was quite enlightening if you're not necessarily aware of how soccer is outside of just national programs, where to get funneled into the national programs, sometimes you're talking about thousands of dollars of investment just to get a sniff, just to get a chance to be in a room where you have scouts looking at yourselves. And there's a lot of so-called academies or so-called combines that are there certainly to make a buck to the detriment of maybe hopes and dreams of young kids. But outside of that, what is there to do today?
Well, it is difficult. And one thing you have to do is recognize the difficulty. And that's my frustration with rants like Taylor's, to be honest, is that it's very easy to say end pay to play. But, you've had guests on who've pointed out, okay, the U.S. has $100 million surplus. That's $25 per kid. That's not going to go very far. So I think what the U.S. needs to do is to step in and cut out the ridiculous expenses. And a lot of it is actually the travel aspect of travel soccer. Why are we flying kids all over the place to play games that aren't necessarily more competitive than they would get if they played someone who was 10 miles away? And that happens all the time. And it means that soccer goes from being, $1,500 to $2,000 a year to being $4,000 to $5,000 a year. And that's just insane. And so the Development Academy, puts a nice little window dressing on that because, you can go play at FC Dallas or Philadelphia for free. Okay, but how much money did you spend to get there? And the answer is usually a lot. And in some cases they say, but we have scholarship money. We can do all this. Okay, but the kid that you're looking at for this academy has 2 working parents. They can't drive their kid all over creation just to play soccer. And so you can say, well, we've made it accessible to everyone because we have a scholarship. No, you haven't. You haven't made it accessible to that family where the parents simply don't have time and the resources to take their kids all over the place.
Fair enough. But I want to go back to the women's side a little bit more here. Inevitably, whenever the men fail or to do something, there is a segment, I think it's a minority, but there's a segment of the women's fan base that starts to sort of relish in it, that starts to flaunt it and put it out there as if this is a good thing somehow that's proving some kind of point. And look, I get there. I'm not dismissing the frustrations amongst certain aspects of how the women's game is treated. I'm not at all. But is there a danger that kind of attitude can lead to complacency, which can then lead to those that are involved in the women's side of the game not taking a hard look at the problems that do actually affect them too?
Complacency in U.S. soccer? No, never. It could never happen. No, you're right. I've seen a ton of complacency. I've seen people who are just sort of smugly say, well, the women don't have problems with defense. Yeah, they do. Have you seen them play recently? Have you seen the youth national teams play recently? Have you seen the youth national teams that haven't qualified for international tournaments? Yeah, they've got problems. And so, yeah, the smugness within, and you're right, it is minority. And I saw, Abby Wambach tweeted yesterday, and she, I believe she used the word gutted. She knows that nobody benefits from this. She knows that it's not like the women suddenly get better because the men didn't make the World Cup. In fact, could be the opposite. And so, yeah, I think that I saw it more from media people. There's been a segment of the U.S. media, and I don't even know if it's really the soccer media as much as it is the sports media, that has long viewed soccer as the sport where the women are better than the men. And yay, let's all get behind it for that reason. That's not going to work. That's not going to work long term. That is not going to help the women's team. That's only going to breed complacency and also the same sort of arrogance. I know some of your other guests have mentioned the arrogance, and I think that's one thing that Steve Gans, running for U.S. Soccer president, wants to tear down is just the mentality that a lot of people have within U.S. soccer, men and women, that, oh yeah, we know what we're doing. Well, you don't always.
But now we're looking at the roster and the management position, especially the coaching staff. There might be a very high turnover. Would you do a clean slate? Would you do a move that would maybe orient this team, put them into the direction where they're looking at the future rather than the present or the past?
I think that Pulisic kid needs to stay. So okay. I wouldn't wipe out everybody, but certainly everyone's going to age out. A lot of people are simply going to be too old, and we've heard some talk about the lost generation of people in their mid-20s. There aren't a lot of people in their mid-20s. I think you're going to see a lot of turnover after this World Cup cycle anyway. I mean, no one thinks Arena was hired as the long-term solution. Whether there's now a likelihood that the next coach comes from outside the traditional U.S. soccer pathways, that I don't know. Unfortunately, we have a bad track record with that, where of throwing a lot of money at Jurgen Klinsmann and expecting him to change not just the U.S. soccer team, but the U.S. soccer landscape, the U.S. soccer culture. And that is beyond any one person. And to get back to the women, we need this on the women's side too. There are so many women's soccer players in this country who aren't in love with the game. It was fascinating to read Abby Wambach's memoir, how she didn't really consider herself a fan of the sport. It was something that she was good at. It wasn't something that she really followed. I mean, there are exceptions. I know Alex Morgan often sits down and dissects Barcelona games with her husband. But there are a lot of good women's soccer players who really just aren't into the sport. And the culture, the same lack of soccer culture that we have on the men's side, I think that's doubled on the women's side. And they say, oh, we don't have free play, for young men, for boys. We certainly don't have it for girls either. In fact, I would say even less so. So the women, as much as the men, need to build a soccer culture that it doesn't quite exist here yet. It exists in pockets. It does. There are people who insist, oh no, my neighborhood has great, pickup soccer. Okay, well, good for you. Most of the country, that's not the case.
Bo, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, guys. Good luck to Canada next cycle.
You are listening to Soccer Today. Follow us on Twitter at Soccer Today SPN and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Sports Podcasting Network. You can find the podcast version of all the shows we do on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you get your podcast.
And we're back, Duane. Yep. It's done. It's over. Russia, the dream of, being successful internationally. It's going to wait another 4 years, at least.
5 before the U.S. can play in a World Cup. I mean, look, as I said earlier, as a Canadian, and we are Canadian, we don't hide that. We follow this team closely, but we don't have the same emotional attachment to it that our American guests do. It's just sort of an interest to us. Obviously, as someone that's in Toronto, I like to see Michael Bradley and Josie Altidore do well. I think that, Josie in particular has grown on me in the past couple of years as someone who does a lot of good work outside the game too. So you kind of want him to see him succeeding and get a little defensive of him sometimes when the criticism comes raining down. But look, my concern from a Canadian perspective is that they're going to get the Americans are going to take this as an opportunity to get even more insular in terms of how they approach Major League Soccer and potentially maybe make it more difficult for Canadian players to make a living in that league or any foreign player in that league. I hope they don't do that because I don't think that's the right approach. I think, as Bo just said there, and as others have implied throughout this conversation, that the real change needs to happen well below the professional level. And all this sort of focus on MLS and focus on the structure of MLS is you're focusing on the tip of the iceberg rather than, the majority of the iceberg, which is where the true problems are, right? And if you're just going to fix the tip, fix in your mind anyway, that's not going to really impact the rest of it, which is feeding that tip ultimately, and that's not going to really change much. There's going to be a lot of shows like this and a lot of debate about this in the next few days. The key to this, just as it was up here, isn't necessarily what's said in these days. It's really easy to come out and make these comments and have this reflection in the immediate hours after you fail to make a World Cup. It's going to be more difficult to sustain this conversation into next summer, into the next fall, especially when you're ramping up towards a Women's World Cup, which the U.S. will be, favorites to repeat it. If not, they may not win it, but they'll certainly be right there at the end, you would assume. That will distract people from there, and it may distract people. As I mentioned to Bo, the complacency may come in. If the U.S. women succeed in that tournament, then you may have people go, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just the men. And that, I think, is a problem that Americans need to really make sure that they don't fall into. Kevin, what are your thoughts overall on this? We probably will wrap here quick because it is a long show at this point, but let's get your thoughts out before we say goodbye for the day.
I think it's just the end result of multiple mistakes along the way, of multiple choices that were the wrong ones over the last few years, going from Klinsmann to different ideas, and not necessarily blaming anyone, but sometimes you have an idea that did work at some part, did work in another country, but for maybe other reason than you analyzed it and figured out, well, like, a blueprint is not always transferable. Like, even though you can try the same blueprint somewhere else, there's outside factors, intangible, that sometimes you don't take into consideration and make a big difference between a project working or not, or an experience being replicated. And it hasn't been the case for the United States, and it did put them in a situation where they find themselves with a starting 11, starting 18 that wasn't up to par, and no one else to push to take over. And that's kind of like the biggest mistake, is not preparing anyone to take anybody's place.
Yeah. All right. In the days ahead, we will obviously talk more about this situation and also get into the rest of the world, because there was a lot of interesting stuff that happened there. We sort of touched on that a little bit with Rudi. Chile falling out. We now have 3 Confederate champions out of this World Cup. I'm not sure that's ever happened before, because Cameroon's out as well as the United States and Chile, obviously the 2-time defending champions of the Copas. So that was a bit of a shocker there. We have Peru that I think is set up to do something historic in a generation for them. Iceland qualifying. There's lots of stories out there. The Messi situation, which is was the feel good story of the last night, if you believe in stars and want to see the stars come through. And if you look at the Knoble qualifying last night, Kevin, there was all the stars were coming through in the end. They were scoring big goals. Alexis scored a goal to pretty much drive things forward. You had James Rodriguez scoring a goal that put Colombia back to the World Cup. You had a lot of stars. Suarez scored a couple goals for Uruguay to clinch their spot last night. So there was a lot of good stories too. But in this part of the world, there is one story, and that is the U.S. failing to qualify, and it is a massive story over here. I know that we do have some listeners that aren't in North America that may not quite understand the ramifications of this, but this is far-reaching in this part of the globe, and it's something that we're not going to see the full fallout for. Probably understand the full fallout for it for quite a while now, but we'll continue to follow it as always on Soccer Today Daily. We'll be back tomorrow, clearly, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about the rest of the world. But until that time, as always, Kevin, I'll let you say goodbye.
The amount of CEOs of big companies biting their lips right now with the opportunities missed for next year marketing wise. Anyways, a lot of ramification to what happened last night. As always, you can follow Duane on Twitter at 24th Minute and myself at Kev Laramee. Thanks to all our guests today to make this show happen. We needed, especially, you needed to hear it. We needed to talk about it. And as always, you can listen to us Monday to Friday, 10 a.m. usually, on YouTube, live, anywhere. And until tomorrow, have a great soccer.
You can find the podcast version of all the shows we do on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you get your podcast.